They erased alien girl name from history, but human tattooed it on the stars. They said her name had never existed. Not in any document, not in any log, not in the bloodied annals of the final war, not even in the whispers of rebel scholars, who clung to scraps of what used to be truth. But he remembered. Ilias Markin remembered her name the way his bones remembered gravity, the way his heartbeat still stumbled at the echo of her laughter, the way silence in deep space still rang with the ghost of her last breath. History, curated and sterilized by the victors, declared that the Atraxi race had no queen, that their resistance had been leaderless, that they were little more than an irrational, bio-enhanced faction that refused assimilation into the unified core. But Ilias knew better. He had touched her fingers when they trembled. He had carried her body through the ruins of her own palace. He had watched her eyes dim as the orbital fleet fell in flames behind her. And when the extermination protocols were broadcast across the quadrant, when even her statues were pulverized and every data node with her likeness magnetically scorched, Ilias did not look away. He encoded her final words into the core memory of his ship, the Brave Mern, even though possessing her image became a capital crime. They called her dangerous. They said the mere idea of her stirred unrest. But Ilias never served empires, and now he served only memory. 20 years had passed since the Purge, since the Atraxi language was outlawed and their culture deemed non-essential and deleted. 20 years since Zariel was dragged into myth by design. But not for him, never for him. He had wandered star clusters uncharted, following radiation trails of lost rebel ships, visiting craters where her people once danced in crystalline halls under alien moons, gathering what remained scraps of murals, fragments of her writings. Smuggled in ash-coated storage units, the last voice recording she ever made before the final siege. Every piece he found he carved into the hull of his ship, not with lasers, not with code, but with hand tools. He traced her symbols with a diamond edge, pressing each one as if chiseling through time. The ship itself had become a floating cathedral of memory, a forbiddance museum, a moving rebellion against oblivion. Every world he visited told him to forget. From the core systems to the fractured outer belts, no archive spoke of Zariel. Children were taught that the Atraxi were mad, self-destructive, incompatible with the peace the unified core offered. Even ex-soldiers who once hunted her now claimed she never existed. Ilias understood. Lies weren't just easier, they were safer. Remembering her was radioactive, but forgetting her was worse. In the quiet of warp tunnels, Ilias replayed her voice to himself, not because he needed to hear it, but because he feared one day he might not remember the pitch of it, the rhythm, the barely hidden sorrow in the way she said his name. Ilias, you do not belong to war. She had told him that once, when his hands were still red with the blood of rebels, when he believed he was saving the galaxy from chaos. He didn't understand her then, but he never forgot that moment. He didn't tell her then that he was already hers. Now he carried her in everything. When others chased fortune, he followed echoes. On the shattered moon of Delareth IV, he unearthed a fragment of her crown, a simple circlet of iridescent metal grown from living crystal. He knew it the moment he saw the curvature, the delicate embedded glyphs only Atraxi artisans knew how to fold into matter. On Calvin Station, in a restricted vault, he bribed a disillusioned archivist to let him see a corrupted visual feed from the last siege. There, in 10 silent seconds of grainy footage, Zariel stepped forward in front of her people as the Fezorn of her people as the P10 silent seconds of grainy footage. Zariel stepped forward in front of her people as the Vezum fun as her people as the Fefen seconds of grainy footage. Zariel stepped forward as Mesim forward, Esem tipped forward. Plasma fire rained. She held no weapon, just her voice. and the image cut off before her final stand. He memorized every frame. In another life, Elias had been a commando trained to erase threats. Now he was a historian of one memory, a guardian of the unspeakable. And it was that unyielding devotion that brought him to the edge of the forbidden zone, to the coordinates. He had paid dearly to retrieve once traded only among dying rebels and hunted monks. They said it was a myth, a place no sensor could penetrate, a moon hidden in black static, shielded by ancient tech that didn't register on modern scans. It had no name, only a whisper, the grave that breathes. Legend said the last loyalists had entombed her there, not in metal or fire, but in the living rock of the moon itself, encoded her DNA into the cavern walls, folded her memory into stone, so that she could never be fully destroyed. But only a fool would seek it, or someone who had nothing left. Elias docked the Bravemern near the magnetic poles, where the interference made eye guidance systems twitch. He landed by hand. The surface was dark gray, flat and still, but beneath it his instincts felt the pulse of something. He wore no insignia, only a simple black coat lined with the symbols he had carved himself, her language, her verses, her dreams. He walked alone for 6 kilometers. The wind screamed with static. The stars above seemed to hesitate, as if afraid to look down. Then he found it, not a tomb, a wound. A canyon split into the rock like a scar, lined with luminescent roots that pulsed a slow, mournful blue. He descended in silence. At the bottom was a vault door grown of obsidian matter, unmarked, half-organic. It should not have opened. It did. No code, no touch. Just his presence. She remembered him. The chamber was not cold. It hummed like a heartbeat. And at its center, floating in a matrix of starlit dust, was her body, preserved, intact, eyes closed, as if sleeping. Time had not touched her, nor had death. He did not move, he could not. The sight of her undid years of numbness. Her skin shimmered faintly under the suspended energy field. Her hair still bore the faint trace of her battle crest. She looked as if she would wake if he dared speak. He knelt, not because she was royalty, but because she was all that was left of something beautiful the universe had tried to kill. "Zari," he whispered, and the room did not echo. It listened. He took out the final artifact he had retrieved, a data crystal holding her poetry. Long thought lost, he placed it near the field. The starlight bent slightly, as if acknowledging it. Then he did what he came to do. He took out the nanoblade and extended it over his forearm. Slowly, painfully, he etched her full name into his skin in Atraxi script, every syllable, every curve. Blood mixed with tears. And as the final letter seared into his flesh, the chamber pulsed once, warm and full. Somewhere above, the Bravemern captured the signal. A burst of her language transmitted upward. And when the stars heard it, they remembered. For the first time in 2 decades, a satellite caught a phrase no longer allowed to exist. Her name, once erased, now shimmered in the frequency bands of deep space. One human had spoken it where it mattered. One human had defied history. And the stars, once silent, answered. For years after the alien girl vanished from records and whispers, Yalin hunted the scars of her memory like a pilgrim desperate for relics of the divine. Every archive he accessed had been purged. Her birth designation, her planetary origin, the names of her people all missing, redacted, replaced with blank fields and glitched timestamps. But in the dark corners of the old spacefaring forums, and in the corrupted cores of crashed satellites drifting between sectors, Yalin found fragments. A sound file with her voice humming a lullaby in a language no longer spoken. A shattered holocube containing a freeze frame of her touching a flower with silent wonder. And most chilling of all, a short, heavily encrypted data string buried in the logs of a defunct AI that read only, "All truths are dangerous to the victor." It became clear that not only had the alien girl been erased, but someone had taken great care to make remembering her dangerous. Yalin didn't care. Love, real love, does not bow to redactions. It fights them. So he traveled to places the governments had labeled anomalous and non-essential, the black zones, the dusted colonies, the backwater moons where the old tech still flickered. He found survivors who spoke only in riddles and shivered when Anban shone her holograph. A one-eyed star-mapper told him, "I saw her once. She healed my son with a touch." And they called her a weapon for that. A deep space botanist swore the alien girl had restored an entire ecosystem with nothing but her presence. Still, the empires feared her, and what empires fear, they bury. Yalin realized she hadn't just been a girl with strange genes or a fragile heart, she'd been a symbol, one that could have united species, rewritten what was known about sentience, or made the war profiteers obsolete. No wonder they annihilated her story. But Yalin wasn't searching for her name to rebel against the regimes. He was doing it because he loved her, and love remembers. Love resists forgetting. One day, on a mining asteroid turned sanctuary for data exiles, Yalin met a woman named Anai who claimed she had once served in the convoy that smuggled the alien girl as a diplomatic envoy to Earth. She spoke 20 languages, Anai whispered, but she was always silent when humans fought near her. It hurt her to hear war. Then, after a pause, she added, "They killed her spirit before they killed her name." The words nearly buckled Jalin's knees. Still, it gave him a direction. There had been a ship, a failed diplomatic mission, a betrayal. With Anai's help, Jalin reconstructed part of the star path and found where the final ship logs were housed deep beneath the Martian Moon Archive, guarded by biometric barriers. Breaking in wasn't easy. He had to sell every last ounce of credit, bribe 3 rogue AI custodians, and trick an old-century droid by wearing a dead ambassador's neural imprint. But once inside, what he discovered hollowed him. The alien girl had not died in battle. She had not disappeared in a heroic sacrifice. She had simply been denied food, medicine, and language until her body stopped. Her captors labeled her non-viable for resettlement and disposed of her quietly. Then they deleted every mention, every file, every trace. But they made one mistake. In her final hours, she had written something on the wall of her containment. Cell, not words, a pattern, a celestial sequence. Yalin recognized it immediately. It was a star cluster only visible from a forgotten quadrant called the Reach, far outside charted borders. Her last message wasn't a cry for help. It was a location, a memory, a whisper to someone who might still care. And Yalin, trembling, knew where to go. He gathered what little remained of her legacy holograms, corrupted code, her DNA sequencing, embedded in an extinct flower's pollen, and set a course for the Reach. When he arrived, he found an asteroid drifting alone in the void. It wasn't marked on any map, had no natural gravity, and seemed utterly lifeless. But as he stepped onto its surface in a pressure suit, something inside him surged. The same melody she used to hum filled the silence. The air shimmered faintly, and in the distance, he saw a mound of crystalline dust shaped like a sleeping figure. Her. Not a grave, not a tomb. A starlit echo. Somehow, she had embedded herself into the asteroid structure, fusing her memories, her energy, into the rock. This was not just where she died. This was where she became part of the universe. Yalin collapsed to his knees, unable to speak. He touched the shimmering figure, and it pulsed faintly. He wept. Not just for her, but for every trace of her that had been wiped from memory, for every child who would never learn her name, for every culture that could have been healed by her light. And then, in silence, he opened the satchel he had carried. For years. Inside it were nanodust filaments, light-carving motes used to engrave asteroid stations with designations. He programmed them with the data he had recovered, her voice, her image, her DNA, her celestial pattern. And above it all, her real name, the one he had found buried in the oldest code layer of the diplomatic log. Alariath, daughter of Starless, voice of peace. He watched as the filaments etched the story across the face of the asteroid, line by glowing line, visible from light years away. When he finished, he linked the coordinates into the star map civilian layer, ensuring that anyone, anywhere, who looked toward the reach would see her name forever burning in the cold. He had done it. He had tattooed her legacy on the stars. And as the asteroid turned gently in the dark, Yalin whispered, "Now no one can erase you again." He lay down beside her form, his suit sealed, his breath steady, and finally slept surrounded by memory, by light, by love that endured beyond. Deletion. The star map was finished. Not on paper or canvas, not etched into the hull of some forgotten freighter or printed in some government database that could be deleted again, but engraved into the gravitational resonance of a newly charted System 7. Stars, aligned in such a precise arc that only someone who had studied her genetic map, her flight signature, her childhood drawings, and the shapes she traced in frost on windows would understand it was a name. Not her assigned designation from the biolabs of Devarik Prime, not the number she wore stitched to her collar when they called her property, but the name she whispered to the human when they were both too tired to lie. Kale stood in the command deck of the Beacon, his once illegal research vessel now old, patched, and nearly held together by nostalgia, and stared out at the final leg of the tribute. Each star, subtly nudged into position over years of solar engineering, shimmered like part of a celestial signature. Zerai, that was her name, and he had spoken it aloud to the universe. He remembered the first time she told him, not with words, but with memories shared through the translation neural bridge. Her species didn't vocalize names, not the way humans did, but he felt it, a cascade of warmth, grief, and an impossible kind of royalty. Zerai, meaning both rebirth and forgotten first light in her ancestral tongue. He whispered it again now, alone on the bridge, as the last star locked into place. With it, the sequence was complete. Somewhere in the algorithms of galactic charting software, navigators would begin to notice the pattern. Someone would ask why this star cluster had been marked with subtle energy signatures that pulsed in rhythmic prime intervals, why it aligned in the exact shape of a certain glyph now forbidden in 3 empires. Maybe someone would decode it. Maybe they wouldn't. It didn't matter. Because Kale knew that for the first time in decades, her name was safe. They had tried everything to erase her. After the Annexation War, after the Varex Accords, when her people were disarmed and their sovereignty declared biologically incompatible with galactic peace, they rewrote everything. Her kind had once ruled the third arm of the spiral. Now their birth world was listed as a research colony with no native life. Statues were dismantled, libraries purged, and those who remembered were silenced through bribes or fire. Kale had watched it happen in real time, powerless. He was only a linguist then, assigned to decode her species myths for cultural documentation before integration. But integration turned into occupation, and occupation turned into genocide by bureaucracy. When the order of genetic purity passed, universal policy barring non-functional ancestries, her DNA became contraband. They didn't kill her outright. No, they did something worse. They unmade her. And when she resisted, when she stood at the gates of the Delphi tribunal and demanded they acknowledge what had been stolen, they labeled her an extremist. Her trial lasted 9 minutes. She died before the verdict was even read. Not by violence, but by internal override. Her kind could self-terminate, they said. So they made her choose between watching her people turn to drones or ending her own story. Kale never forgave himself for not pulling her out sooner, for not seeing how far they'd go, for letting her stand there alone. For years after, he disappeared from history himself. His credentials revoked, his life savings flagged as sympathy funding, he became a ghost. Not even the fringe colonies would hire him, but that was fine. Ghosts remember. Ghosts carry stories. And while they tried to rewrite hers, he wrote it back first on scraps, then in code, then in the shape of stars. The second system he built was a series of dwarf suns whose orbits produced musical oscillations in the subatomic frequency range when mapped. The sound translated into the lullaby she once sang in her sleep. A forgotten melody, recorded only once, long before the archives were cleansed. The third system was a visual memory, 3 nebulae arranged by radiative fuel bursts to form the silhouette of her profile as seen in the atmospheric light of her homeworld. It took him 14 years to nudge the cosmic dust into place, but every grain mattered. By then, people began to notice. Fringe scientists, rogue historians, even smugglers all began to speculate about this anonymous engineer, this cartographer. Of the Forbiddens. They called him the Star Guardian. Conspiracy theories bloomed. Was he mapping the return of the Lost Empire? Predicting divine reincarnation? Building a weapon? Kale ignored it all. He had no use for fame or followers or politics. He didn't even answer the coded pings from underground resistors. This wasn't rebellion. It was love. The kind of love that outlives breath. The kind of love that doesn't want revenge, only memory. Still, the empires noticed, and they hated it. Twice they sent stealth drones to sabotage his stellar platforms. Once they tried to infect his nav AI with sleeper viruses that would reroute his ship into black holes. They failed, because Kale was no longer just a man. He was a vessel of memory, and memory, once awakened, cannot be extinguished. He trained his own systems to recognize ideological patterns. Every enemy transmission was filtered, parsed, and archived. He never deleted them. Because one day, someone would need to remember how far power will go to silence beauty. On the day the final star aligned, what would have been her 100th solar birth cycle, he opened the beacon's inner sanctum. No one had entered it in 30 years. It was sealed with a genetic lock, one encoded with the last strand of her DNA he ever preserved a kiss, recorded from the tear-streaked skin of his neck the night before her trial. Inside there were no lights, only silence. The walls were covered in ancient script from her native world, carved by hand. It was their story, not the version approved by tribunals or reconstructed in diplomatic treaties. The real one. From the first time she touched the leaves of Earth's trees with wide eyes and said they felt like laughter, to the night she held his hand through a riot shield and told him, "You remember me, and I live forever." He sat there in silence for hours, not crying, just breathing, as if keeping air in his lungs kept her name alive. Then he stood, pressed a final command into the altar's console. And the stars answered. Throughout the quadrant, navigational. Systems flickered, drones redirected, comms buzzed, and slowly, silently, the stars pulsed with coded light. Her name, Zerai, again and again, across frequencies, across language. Even those who didn't understand it felt it. The way one feels. A song they've never heard but somehow know. Kale sat back in the captain's chair and for the first time in decades allowed himself to rest. He didn't know how long he had. His body was failing, the radiation from the solar forges long having taken its toll. He had refused medical. aid for years, knowing it would only prolong what he needed to finish. But now, with her name immortalized in the heavens, he felt peace. Not victory, not closure, just peace. And as he closed his eyes for the final time, the stars whispered her name back to him in tones only a soul could hear. Somewhere, perhaps in a dimension science had yet to chart, a girl made of light and memory looked up and smiled. Her name was no longer erased. She lived, in orbit, in code, in the sky, and in the heart of one human who never stopped loving her, even when the universe tried to forget.